This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the autumn of 1953, the Ashworth family acquired a modest farmhouse in the remote hills of Newton County, Arkansas, approximately 15 miles southeast of Jasper. The property, consisting of 47 acres of dense woodland and a single cleared field, had remained vacant for nearly 2 decades following the mysterious departure of its previous owners. Cornelius Ashworth, a veteran of the European theater who had struggled to readjust to civilian life, saw in this isolation exactly what his fractured nerves required. His wife, Isadora, a former school teacher from Little Rock, harbored reservations about their relocation to such a remote location, but supported her husband's conviction that distance from civilization would provide the healing he desperately needed. The house itself bore the weathered marks of Ozark vernacular architecture, constructed sometime in the 1880s with local limestone and rough-hewn timber. 2 stories rose above a partial basement. The structure's foundation settled unevenly into the hillside terrain. Previous owners had made additions over the decades, creating an asymmetrical layout that confused visitors and challenged even longtime residents to navigate confidently. The most recent occupants, according to county records, had been the Meredith family, who departed abruptly in 1934, leaving behind most of their possessions and, curiously, no forwarding address with local authorities or neighbors. Cornelius found employment with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, conducting wildlife surveys in the remote backcountry that suited both his preference for solitude and his military training in land navigation. Isadora established a small correspondence school, teaching basic literacy to isolated mountain families whose children could not easily reach conventional educational institutions. Their life fell into a pattern of quiet routine, marked by long periods of silence broken only by the sounds of wind through ancient oaks and the distant calls of wildlife that populated the surrounding wilderness. The basement of the Ashworth house served primarily as storage for Isadora's teaching materials and Cornelius's hunting equipment. The space, accessible through both interior stairs and an external cellar door, consisted of 3 connected chambers carved into the hillside. 2 of these rooms contained the expected accumulation of rural household overflow, preserved foods, seasonal clothing, farming tools, and stacks of newspapers that previous occupants had apparently saved for insulation purposes. The 3rd chamber, however, remained locked behind a heavy wooden door that neither Cornelius nor Isadora had ever successfully opened, despite repeated attempts with various keys discovered throughout the house. In March of 1954, while organizing teaching supplies in the basement's main chamber, Isadora discovered a leather portfolio wedged behind a wooden support beam. The portfolio contained architectural drawings of the house, executed with professional precision and dated 1889. These plans revealed details of the structure's original construction that differed significantly from its current configuration. Most notably, the drawings indicated that the locked basement chamber should connect to a 4th room, smaller and deeper, that the current layout did not account for. The architectural drawings also included notations in a careful script that referred to this missing space as the preservation chamber, though no explanation accompanied this designation. Cornelius examined the drawings extensively, using his military engineering background to understand the structural implications. The missing chamber appeared to extend beneath what was currently the kitchen floor, suggesting that access might be possible through removal of floorboards. More intriguingly, the original plans indicated that the locked wooden door was not the chamber's primary entrance. According to the architectural drawings, access to both the locked chamber and the mysterious preservation chamber should be possible through a concealed panel somewhere along the basement's eastern wall. The search for this concealed entrance consumed several weekends of methodical investigation. Cornelius and Isadora examined every stone and timber along the eastern wall, testing for hollow spaces or unusual construction techniques. Their persistence was rewarded on a particularly humid afternoon when Isadora noticed that a section of limestone blocks produced a different sound when tapped. Further investigation revealed that a vertical line of mortar had been deliberately disguised to conceal what was, in fact, a narrow doorway. The concealed entrance required considerable effort to open. Years of settling and moisture had sealed the hidden door firmly in place. Cornelius employed a combination of leverage and patient chipping away of accumulated debris to gradually work the panel free. When the passage finally yielded, it revealed a narrow corridor, perhaps 3 feet wide, that extended into complete darkness. The air that emerged carried an odor that neither Cornelius nor Isadora could immediately identify, though both noted its unpleasant and somehow organic quality. Equipped with flashlights and lanterns, the couple entered the hidden passage. The corridor extended approximately 12 feet before opening into the chamber identified on the architectural drawings as locked from the main basement. This space, roughly 8 feet square, contained shelving along 3 walls and a heavy wooden table positioned in the center. However, it was the chamber's contents, rather than its configuration, that commanded their immediate and disturbed attention. The shelving contained hundreds of glass jars, each carefully labeled with dates ranging from 1889 to 1933. The contents of these jars appeared to be organic specimens preserved in various solutions, though the specific nature of these specimens remained unclear in the dim lighting. The wooden table bore stains that suggested long use for some type of preparation or examination work. Most disturbing, however, were the detailed logbooks stacked on a small desk positioned beneath a high, narrow window that provided the chamber's only natural light source. The logbooks, written in multiple hands spanning several decades, contained entries that documented some form of systematic activity conducted by previous occupants of the house. Early entries, dating from the 1890s, were written in the precise script of someone with considerable education. Later entries, extending through the 1920s and early 1930s, showed the handwriting of at least 3 different individuals. The most recent entries, dated just months before the Meredith family's mysterious departure in 1934, appeared increasingly erratic and were often difficult to decipher. The content of these logbooks proved deeply unsettling. The entries described a practice referred to as preparation and preservation of specimens for study, though the exact nature of this study remained deliberately vague. However, certain details emerged that suggested activities far beyond conventional scientific inquiry. References appeared to experiments conducted on various subjects, with careful documentation of responses to different treatments and applications. The clinical language could not entirely disguise the disturbing implications of what was being described. A logbook entry dated November 15, 1923, written in careful cursive, recorded, "Subject showed remarkable resistance to the standard preparation. Required extended application of Method 7 before achieving desired state of compliance. Physical deterioration occurred more rapidly than anticipated, necessitating acceleration of the preservation protocol. Results archived in Container Series M, specimens 47 through 52. The entry concluded with a note about improved efficiency in future applications. Another entry, dated August 3, 1931, demonstrated the increasingly erratic nature of the later logbook contents. The sounds from the preservation chamber continued despite completion of the protocol 3 days ago. Meredith insists this is normal settling, but the rhythmic nature suggests otherwise. Have sealed the access temporarily until sounds cease. Cannot afford to attract attention from Valley residents, especially with the Henderson inquiry ongoing." This entry was followed by several pages torn from the logbook, leaving gaps in the chronological record. The preservation chamber referenced in the logbooks proved to be accessible through a second concealed entrance at the far end of the first hidden chamber. This entrance, unlike the first, showed signs of having been recently sealed with fresh mortar and timber bracing. Cornelius noted that this sealing work appeared to have been completed hastily, with tool marks suggesting urgency rather than craftsmanship. The removal of this barrier required several hours of careful work to avoid destabilizing the surrounding structure. Beyond this second barrier lay a smaller chamber, perhaps 6 feet square, with a ceiling so low that both Cornelius and Isadora were forced to crouch while investigating its contents. This space contained additional shelving, but the preservation jars here were larger and their contents more disturbing. Several jars contained what appeared to be complete organ systems suspended in cloudy solutions. Others held specimens that defied easy categorization, though their organic origin seemed evident from their preservation state. More disturbing than the preserved specimens was the presence of personal effects stored on shelving along the chamber's back wall. These items, carefully arranged and labeled, included clothing, jewelry, eyeglasses, and other belongings that suggested they had been removed from individuals who had undergone the preparation process, documented in the logbooks. A wooden box contained dozens of identification documents, photographs, and personal papers spanning several decades. These materials indicated that the subjects of the preservation experiments had included people from across a wide geographical area, suggesting that the activities conducted in these chambers had drawn participants or victims from well beyond the immediate Ozark region. Among these personal effects, Isadora discovered a small, leather-bound journal that differed from the clinical logbooks. This journal contained personal entries written by someone involved in the preservation activities, but apparently experiencing increasing distress about their participation. The entries, spanning approximately 6 months in 1932, documented growing concern about the ethical implications of the work being conducted. The author, who signed entries only with the initial M, expressed particular anxiety about what they described as responses from subjects that suggest awareness persists beyond the completion of preservation protocols. One journal entry, dated June 18, 1932, revealed significant internal conflict. Cannot continue to ignore the evidence that our procedures are not achieving the intended result. The preservation process appears to maintain certain vital functions while eliminating others, creating a state that defies our understanding of natural biology. The subjects show signs of distress that persist well beyond what should be physiologically possible. Meredith refuses to acknowledge these observations, insisting that what we interpret as distress is merely residual muscular response. However, the coordination of these responses suggests otherwise. The final entries in this personal journal documented escalating horror at the implications of their discoveries. The sounds from the preservation chamber have intensified. Subject 73 was processed according to standard protocol 48 hours ago, yet the rhythmic tapping continues. When I approached the preservation unit last night, the tapping paused for several minutes, then resumed in a pattern that seemed almost responsive. Meredith has forbidden further investigation, claiming that external observation interferes with the preservation process. I fear we have achieved something beyond preservation, something that should not continue to exist in its current state. The discovery of these materials in the hidden chambers affected both Cornelius and Isadora profoundly, though their responses differed significantly. Isadora experienced immediate revulsion and urged that they contact authorities to investigate what appeared to be evidence of serious criminal activity. Cornelius, however, became fascinated by the technical aspects of the preservation methods described in the logbooks. His military background had exposed him to various forms of battlefield trauma, and he found himself analyzing the procedures with a clinical detachment that disturbed his wife. Their disagreement about how to proceed with their discovery created the first serious conflict in their marriage. Isadora argued that they had a moral obligation to report their findings, while Cornelius maintained that the activities had ceased decades earlier and that involving authorities would only result in unwanted attention and possibly legal complications for them as current property owners. The presence of the preserved specimens and personal effects in their basement could potentially implicate them in the original crimes, regardless of their obvious innocence. As autumn progressed into winter, their conflict intensified rather than resolved. Isadora found herself unable to sleep peacefully, knowing what lay beneath their house. She began experiencing nightmares that featured the organic specimens floating in their preservation solutions, and she frequently awakened with the conviction that she could hear sounds emanating from the basement chambers. Cornelius attributed these sounds to the settling of old timbers and the normal acoustics of underground spaces, but Isadora remained convinced that something more disturbing was occurring. The isolation that had initially attracted Cornelius to the property now became a source of additional stress for Isadora. The nearest neighbors lived more than 3 miles away, and the mountain roads became nearly impassable during winter weather. The telephone service to their location was unreliable at best, and extended periods of communication blackout were common during storms. Isadora began to feel trapped not only by the geographical isolation, but by the terrible knowledge of what their home concealed. In December of 1954, Isadora made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of their discovery. Without consulting Cornelius, she wrote a detailed letter to the Arkansas State Police describing the hidden chambers and their contents. However, rather than immediately mailing this letter, she decided to conduct additional investigation of the materials they had found, hoping to provide authorities with more comprehensive information that might aid in identifying victims and prosecuting those responsible for the activities documented in the logbooks. This additional investigation led to several disturbing revelations. Cross-referencing the personal effects with missing persons reports from regional newspapers revealed that many of the individuals whose belongings were stored in the preservation chamber had disappeared under circumstances that attracted significant local attention. The geographical distribution of these disappearances suggested that the perpetrators had deliberately targeted isolated individuals who were traveling through the Ozark region, particularly those whose temporary absence might not be immediately noticed. More disturbing was the discovery that several of the identification documents belonged to individuals who had disappeared as recently as 1933, just 1 year before the Meredith family's abrupt departure. This timeline suggested that the preservation activities had continued until very shortly before the house was abandoned, raising questions about what had ultimately caused the cessation of these experiments. The hastily sealed entrance to the preservation chamber suggested that the activities had ended suddenly rather than through gradual conclusion. Among the final entries in the clinical logbooks, Isadora found references to what the authors described as complications in the preservation process. These entries suggested that the later experiments had produced results that exceeded the expectations or capabilities of those conducting them. One entry, dated March 7, 1933, recorded, Subject 81, continues to demonstrate responsiveness 6 weeks after preservation completion. Standard termination protocols prove ineffective. Physical deterioration has ceased entirely while awareness indicators remain active. Meredith suggests extended observation to document long-term preservation effects, but containment is becoming increasingly difficult. The final legible entry in the logbooks, dated September 22, 1933, was written in a handwriting that showed extreme agitation. Cannot maintain containment any longer. Subject 81 has achieved some form of communication with recently processed subjects. The collective response suggests coordination that should be impossible given their condition. Meredith has disappeared, along with all documentation related to advanced preservation protocols. I am sealing all chambers permanently and departing immediately. May God forgive us for what we have created in this place. This final entry explained the hasty sealing of the preservation chamber access and provided context for the Meredith family's mysterious departure several months later. However, it also raised the disturbing possibility that the preservation activities had achieved results that exceeded the perpetrator's understanding or control. The references to ongoing responsiveness and coordination among preserved subjects suggested that the experiments had created something beyond what conventional scientific knowledge could explain. During her investigation of these materials, Isadora began experiencing symptoms that she initially attributed to stress and lack of sleep. She developed a persistent awareness of sounds emanating from the basement, particularly during the night hours. These sounds, which she described as rhythmic tapping or scratching, seemed to follow patterns that suggested deliberate communication attempts. When she mentioned these sounds to Cornelius, he dismissed them as products of her overwrought imagination, though he privately began conducting his own evening investigations of the basement chambers. Cornelius's nocturnal investigations revealed that the sounds Isadora reported were in fact audible and appeared to originate from the sealed preservation chamber. The tapping patterns showed a complexity that defied explanation through normal settling or environmental factors. More disturbing, the sound seemed to respond to external stimuli. When Cornelius tested this possibility by tapping on the walls near the sealed entrance, the sounds from within would pause, then resume in patterns that seemed to echo or answer his experimental tapping. These discoveries forced Cornelius to reconsider his initial dismissal of Isadora's concerns. The evidence suggested that something within the preservation chamber remained active decades after the original experiments had ended. This possibility contradicted everything he understood about natural biological processes, yet the evidence of his own senses could not be easily dismissed. The preserved specimens in the adjacent chamber showed no signs of deterioration despite their apparent age, suggesting that the preservation methods employed had achieved remarkable success in maintaining biological material in a stable state. By January 1955, both Cornelius and Isadora were experiencing significant psychological effects from their ongoing proximity to the hidden chambers and their contents. Isadora suffered from persistent insomnia and had lost considerable weight due to decreased appetite. Cornelius found himself increasingly obsessed with understanding the technical methods employed in the preservation experiments, spending hours studying the logbook entries and attempting to decipher the more cryptic references to advanced protocols and enhanced preservation states. Their mutual deterioration was interrupted by an unexpected development that provided external validation for their concerns. In late January, a representative from the Arkansas State Historical Society contacted them regarding their property's potential historical significance. The representative, Dr. Lysander Blackthorne, explained that he was conducting research into the Meredith family's activities in the region during the early 20th century. His investigation had been prompted by recently discovered correspondence in the Arkansas State Archives that suggested the Meredith family had conducted some form of scientific research at their Newton County property. Dr. Blackthorne's interest in the property stemmed from his broader research into unconventional medical practices in isolated communities during the early 1900s. He explained that many rural areas had developed unique approaches to medical treatment that combined traditional folk remedies with experimental techniques that often crossed ethical boundaries. The Meredith family, according to archival correspondence, had claimed to have developed revolutionary preservation methods for biological specimens that might have applications in medical education and research. The timing of Dr. Blackthorn's visit created a significant dilemma for Cornelius and Isadora. They had not yet contacted authorities about their discoveries, partly due to Cornelius's concerns about potential legal implications, and partly because they lacked clear guidance about how to properly report their findings. Dr. Blackthorn's scholarly interest provided an opportunity to gain expert perspective on their discoveries without immediately involving law enforcement agencies. After considerable debate, they decided to reveal their discoveries to Dr. Blackthorn, though they initially limited their disclosure to the hidden chambers and their contents without mentioning the ongoing sounds that both had been hearing. Dr. Blackthorn's response to seeing the preserved specimens and reading portions of the logbooks was one of intense scientific fascination, tempered by growing ethical concern. He immediately recognized that the preservation techniques described exceeded anything documented in conventional medical literature of the period. Dr. Blackthorn's examination of the materials confirmed many of Isadora's worst fears about the nature of the activities that had been conducted in the chambers. The personal effects and identification documents clearly indicated that the preservation experiments had been conducted on human subjects, most of whom appeared to have been unwilling participants. The clinical language of the logbooks could not disguise the evidence that numerous individuals had been subjected to experimental procedures that had ultimately resulted in their deaths. More disturbing was Dr. Blackthorn's assessment of the preservation techniques themselves. His review of the logbook entries suggested that the perpetrators had achieved a level of biological preservation that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding. The specimens showed no signs of deterioration despite decades of storage, suggesting that the preservation methods employed had been remarkably effective. However, the references to ongoing responsiveness and awareness in preserved subjects indicated that these methods had achieved results that their creators had not anticipated or fully understood. Dr. Blackthorn's scholarly perspective provided crucial context for understanding the broader implications of their discovery. He explained that the early 20th century had witnessed numerous examples of experimental medical research conducted without proper oversight or ethical constraints. Isolated communities, particularly in regions like the Ozarks, had sometimes become testing grounds for procedures that would not have been acceptable in more regulated environments. The Meredith family's activities appeared to represent an extreme example of such unregulated experimentation. However, Dr. Blackthorn's investigation also revealed disturbing connections between the Meredith family's activities and a broader network of similar experimental programs. His research had uncovered correspondence between members of the Meredith family and other individuals conducting comparable research in isolated locations across the Southeast. These letters suggested that the preservation experiments conducted in the basement chambers were part of a larger coordinated effort to develop advanced biological preservation techniques for purposes that remained unclear. The correspondence indicated that the Meredith family's work was considered particularly advanced within this network of researchers. Other participants frequently requested detailed information about the specific methods employed at the Newton County location, and several letters expressed frustration that the Meredith family had become increasingly secretive about their procedures in the final years of their research. The abrupt termination of communications in 1933 had apparently left other researchers without access to the advanced protocols that had produced the most successful preservation results. This broader context raised the possibility that the hidden chambers contained not only evidence of local criminal activity, but documentation of a wider conspiracy involving multiple locations and numerous victims. Dr. Blackthorn suggested that a proper investigation would need to involve federal authorities with the resources to investigate potential interstate criminal activity spanning multiple decades. The weight of these revelations prompted Isadora to finally mail her letter to the Arkansas State Police, though she supplemented it with additional documentation that Dr. Blackthorne helped her prepare. The initial police response was skeptical, as the claim seemed almost too extraordinary to be credible. However, the involvement of Dr. Blackthorne and his academic credentials provided sufficient legitimacy to prompt a preliminary investigation. The police investigation began in earnest during March 1955, when a team of investigators arrived to examine the hidden chambers and their contents. The lead investigator, Detective Mordecai Thornfield, had previously worked on cases involving missing persons in rural areas and was familiar with the challenges of investigating crimes that had occurred decades earlier. His initial assessment of the evidence confirmed that they were dealing with multiple homicides conducted over an extended period. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the local level as the scope of the evidence became apparent. The personal effects stored in the preservation chamber indicated victims from across multiple states, suggesting that federal jurisdiction would be appropriate. Additionally, the correspondence discovered by Dr. Blackthorne indicated connections to other locations where similar activities might have occurred, necessitating a coordinated investigation across multiple agencies. However, the investigation also encountered significant challenges that complicated efforts to achieve justice for the identified victims. Many of the individuals whose personal effects were found in the chambers had disappeared during periods when record-keeping was less systematic than modern standards. Additionally, the passage of decades had eliminated many potential witnesses and made reconstruction of specific crimes extremely difficult. More problematically, the individuals directly responsible for the preservation experiments appeared to have died or disappeared long before their activities were discovered. The Meredith family members who had conducted the final experiments could not be located despite extensive investigation. Their departure from the region in 1934 had been complete and permanent, leaving no forwarding addresses or contact information with local residents or businesses. The investigation's most disturbing discovery was confirmation that the preservation techniques documented in the logbooks had indeed achieved results that exceeded conventional scientific understanding. Examination of the specimens by qualified medical experts revealed preservation states that could not be explained through known methods. The biological material showed no signs of normal deterioration processes, despite having been stored for decades without any apparent maintenance of the preservation systems. Even more concerning were the findings related to the ongoing sounds that both Cornelius and Isadora had reported hearing from the sealed preservation chamber. When investigators opened this chamber, they discovered preservation units that continued to show signs of activity despite the passage of more than 20 years since their creation. The exact nature of this activity could not be determined through conventional medical examination, but the evidence suggested that some form of biological process remained ongoing within the preservation systems. The investigators faced an unprecedented situation that challenged both their investigative procedures and their understanding of what was scientifically possible. The evidence clearly indicated that serious crimes had been committed, but the nature of those crimes and their ongoing effects defied conventional categorization. The preserved specimens represented both evidence of homicide and something that transcended normal categories of criminal activity. Detective Thornfield's final report, completed in August 1955, documented the evidence of multiple homicides while acknowledging the limitations of the investigation's ability to achieve conventional resolution. The report recommended that the preservation chambers be permanently sealed and that the property be declared unsuitable for residential occupation due to potential health hazards associated with the experimental preservation systems. However, the report also included recommendations for ongoing monitoring of the site due to the unclear nature of the biological activity detected within the sealed preservation units. The impact of the investigation on Cornelius and Isadora proved profound and lasting, The months of living above the hidden chambers, combined with the stress of the police investigation and the disturbing nature of what they had discovered, created psychological effects that persisted long after the official investigation concluded. Isadora never fully recovered from the knowledge of what had occurred in their basement, and she experienced recurring nightmares and anxiety that required ongoing medical treatment. Cornelius's response was more complex. His initial fascination with the technical aspects of the preservation methods evolved into an obsession that concerned both Isadora and Dr. Blackthorne. He repeatedly requested access to the sealed chambers and the preserved specimens, claiming that proper scientific analysis might provide insights that could prevent similar activities in the future. However, his requests were denied due to both safety concerns and the ongoing nature of the criminal investigation. The Ashworth family eventually abandoned the property in Newton County, unable to continue living in a place that held such disturbing memories and implications. They relocated to Little Rock, where Isadora resumed teaching, and Cornelius found employment with the state government. However, both continued to be affected by their experiences, and their marriage never fully recovered from the stress of their discoveries and the subsequent investigation. The property itself was acquired by the state of Arkansas and designated as a restricted area due to the potential health hazards associated with the experimental preservation systems. The hidden chambers were permanently sealed with concrete and steel barriers, though ongoing monitoring continued to detect unexplained activity from within the sealed areas. These monitoring reports, classified due to their sensitive nature, suggested that whatever had been created in those chambers continued to exist in some form decades after its creation. In 1962, Dr. Blackthorne published a scholarly paper about the case that focused on its historical and ethical implications while avoiding specific details about the ongoing biological activity detected at the site. His paper contributed to emerging discussions about the need for oversight of medical research and the potential dangers of unregulated experimentation. However, the most disturbing aspects of the case remained classified and were not included in any public documentation. The broader investigation into the network of researchers connected to the Meredith family ultimately identified potential sites in 4 other states where similar activities may have occurred. However, these investigations produced limited results due to the passage of time and the apparent coordinated destruction of evidence that had occurred when the network disbanded in the early 1930s. The Newton County site remained the only location where substantial physical evidence of the preservation experiments had been preserved. Years later, occasional reports emerged from individuals living in the general vicinity of the sealed property. These reports typically described unexplained sounds, audible during certain weather conditions, though official investigations attributed these sounds to wind patterns and underground water movement. However, some residents of the area continued to report sensory experiences that they found difficult to explain through conventional understanding. The case ultimately raised questions that extended beyond its specific criminal aspects. The evidence suggested that the preservation experiments had achieved results that challenged conventional understanding of biological processes and the boundaries between life and death. The ongoing activity detected within the sealed chambers indicated that some aspect of the experimental subjects had persisted beyond what should have been physiologically possible. Modern scientific understanding provides no framework for explaining the preservation states documented in the Meredith family's experiments. The techniques described in the logbooks combined elements of conventional embalming with procedures that appeared to maintain vital functions while eliminating others. The result appeared to be a condition that preserved awareness and some capacity for response, while eliminating the biological processes normally associated with life. The ethical implications of these discoveries extended beyond the obvious criminality of conducting fatal experiments on unwilling subjects. If the preservation techniques had indeed achieved the results suggested by the evidence, they raised fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and the ethical obligations owed to individuals whose existence had been artificially maintained in states that defied conventional categories. The ongoing monitoring of the sealed site continued to produce results that suggested persistent activity within the preservation systems. These results were classified due to their sensitive nature and their potential to cause public alarm if disclosed. However, the monitoring reports indicated that whatever had been created in those chambers had demonstrated a remarkable persistence that exceeded the expectations of both the original experimenters and the subsequent investigators. The case of the hidden chambers beneath the Ashworth property ultimately became one of those investigations that defied complete resolution. While the criminal aspects were clearly documented and the immediate dangers were contained through the sealing of the preservation chambers, the broader implications of what had been discovered continued to challenge conventional understanding. The evidence suggested that human knowledge had limits that should not be crossed, and that some forms of experimentation could produce results that exceeded the ability to control or comprehend them. The residents of Newton County gradually forgot the specific details of the case, though the property itself became the subject of local folklore that discouraged visitors and maintained the area's isolation. The official records of the investigation were archived in state facilities where they remained accessible only to researchers with appropriate security clearances and demonstrated need for the information. The preservation chambers themselves, sealed beneath tons of concrete and steel, continued to be monitored through remote sensing equipment that detected ongoing activity of an undetermined nature. The monitoring reports, filed quarterly and maintained in classified archives, documented patterns of activity that seemed to follow seasonal cycles while maintaining a baseline level that never completely ceased. Dr. Blackthorne continued his research into similar cases throughout the Southeast, though he never again encountered evidence of preservation techniques as advanced as those documented at the Newton County site. His subsequent publications focused on the historical and ethical aspects of unregulated medical experimentation while avoiding specific technical details that might enable replication of the dangerous procedures he had studied. The impact on those directly involved in the discovery and investigation proved lasting. Cornelius Ashworth died in 1967, apparently from natural causes, though his final years were marked by declining mental health and persistent obsession with understanding the preservation techniques he had encountered. Isadora survived until 1983, but never spoke publicly about their experiences and required ongoing psychiatric care for anxiety and recurring nightmares related to their discovery. Detective Thornfield, who had led the criminal investigation, retired early from law enforcement and avoided discussing the case even with family members. His official reports remained the primary source of documentation about the investigative process, though he repeatedly declined interview requests from researchers and journalists who attempted to learn more about the case's details. The legacy of the hidden chambers ultimately served as a reminder that human curiosity and scientific ambition could lead to discoveries that exceeded the ability to understand or control their implications. The preservation experiments conducted in those chambers had achieved results that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death, while demonstrating the dangers inherent in pursuing knowledge without appropriate ethical constraints. Today, the sealed property remains under state oversight, though the specific nature of the ongoing monitoring is not disclosed to the public. The quarterly reports filed by monitoring personnel continue to document activity from within the sealed chambers, suggesting that whatever was created in those underground rooms has maintained its existence across multiple decades. The persistence of this activity raises questions that modern science remains unable to answer and serves as a permanent reminder that some forms of knowledge come with consequences that extend far beyond the intentions of those who seek them. The case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of unregulated experimentation in American history, though its classified status has prevented full public understanding of its implications. The evidence suggests that the pursuit of advanced preservation techniques had achieved results that exceeded the experimenters' understanding while creating conditions that persisted long after their creators had disappeared. The sounds that occasionally emerge from the vicinity of the sealed chambers continue to be reported by area residents, though official explanations attribute these phenomena to natural causes. However, those familiar with the case's classified details understand that these sounds may represent something far more disturbing than wind or geological activity. They may be evidence that consciousness, once artificially preserved, continues to seek expression even when confined within systems designed to contain it permanently. The question of what exactly was achieved in those preservation chambers remains unanswered, though the evidence suggests that human experimentation had crossed boundaries that should never have been violated. The ongoing activity detected within the sealed chambers serves as a permanent reminder that some scientific pursuits can produce results that outlast and exceed the intentions of those who initiate them. In the end, the case of the hidden chambers beneath the Ashworth property represents something beyond conventional criminal investigation. It stands as evidence that human knowledge has limits that exist for profound reasons, and that the pursuit of understanding, when conducted without appropriate ethical constraints, can create conditions that defy both comprehension and control. The preservation experiments achieved their intended goal of maintaining biological material indefinitely, but the cost of this achievement included the creation of something that continues to exist in a state that challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and mortality. And perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of this case. Not just that serious crimes were committed, but that those crimes achieved results that persist decades later, continuing to demonstrate that some forms of knowledge should remain forever beyond human reach.